When you think of Washington State, what comes to mind? Is it massive, ancient forests and rugged coastlines? Or is it the sprawling, futuristic campuses of some of the biggest tech companies on the planet? Well, what if I told you these aren't two different Washingtons? They're actually two chapters in a single incredible story of economic reinvention.
See, you've got the evergreen state, an identity literally built from the ground up, on timber, on fishing, on agriculture. That was its foundation. But then you have the tech state, this global powerhouse of innovation, driven by jets, software, and online everything. So how on earth does a place so defined by one thing completely transform into the other?
Well, the key to understanding this whole story is an idea called the economic long wave. Just think of it like a life cycle for an entire region's economy. You get this huge wave of growth, right? It's powered by a few key industries. But eventually, that wave peaks, the market gets saturated, and things slow down. That dip is called the trough, a period of stagnation. And it's only after that trough that a brand new wave, with totally new industries, can start to build. This is the lens we're going to use to look at Washington's journey.
Okay, so let's dive into that first chapter. We're going back to Washington's very first economic wave, an era that was all about timber and the back-breaking toil it took to get it.
Now, of course, people have lived on this land for thousands of years. But for our economic story, things really kick into high gear after 1853, when Washington became a territory, and then a state in 1889. This is the moment when the engine of that first great economic wave was really fired up. And I want you to just look at these numbers for a second, because they show the sheer scale we're talking about. In 1899, 2 out of every 3 manufacturing jobs in the entire state were in the lumber industry. By 1905, Washington was the #1 producer of lumber in the whole country. This wasn't just an industry, it was the economy.
But that massive economic engine needed fuel. It needed land, it needed rivers, it needed forests. And that relentless demand for resources, it inevitably led to conflict. This first wave came at a huge human cost, sparking violent struggles like the Puget Sound War. This quote from Chief Leshy of the Nisqually tribe from his own trial just cuts right to the heart of it. He was arguing that he wasn't a criminal. He was a leader fighting for his people's survival against this overwhelming new economy.
And, like always, that first one had to break eventually. As those big resource industries matured, Washington's economy slowed down, and the state entered that trough, a long, quiet period where the old engines of growth just started to run out of steam.
And this wasn't just a vibe. You can see it right here in the data. Think about it. While the rest of the country was in the roaring 20s, Washington's growth was already starting to lag. For about 3 decades, from the 20s all the way into the early 50s, its manufacturing growth was actually slower than the national average. The first wave was officially over.
But here's the fascinating part. This trough wasn't empty. In fact, this is when the seeds of the next wave were being planted. Huge federal projects during the Great Depression gave the state things like the Grand Coulee Dam, which meant tons of cheap electricity. Then came World War II, which brought a massive surge of industry, shipbuilding on the coast, the secret Hanford Works in the east, and all of that created a brand new, highly skilled workforce.
So you've got this new industrial foundation, you've got all this cheap hydroelectric power, and that set the stage perfectly for Washington's second great economic wave, the one built on jets and computer code.
Okay, this slide right here tells you everything you need to know. It's the whole story in one simple chart. Back in 1919, at the absolute peak of the first wave, lumber made up 44% of manufacturing jobs. Fast forward to 1984, and that number has cratered. The new king? Transportation equipment, which is basically a code word for Boeing, making up almost a quarter of all manufacturing jobs. It was a total changing of the guard.
And the second wave didn't happen all at once. It evolved in phases. First, you had Boeing's post-war dominance, which literally put Washington on the global stage. Then, that huge pool of technical talent helped give rise to the next big thing, software, with Microsoft, of course, leading the way. And that, in turn, paved the way for a booming service economy, creating giants like Amazon and Starbucks that export services around the world.
But, hey, sound familiar? Just like that first wave, this incredible new prosperity wasn't without its own problems. The second wave created new kinds of social friction, reigniting old fights over resources and kicking off brand new ones over rights and the direction of this new global economy.
A major example was the fish wars.
For years, native activists like the legendary Billy Frank Jr. of the Nisqually tribe led protests and fish-ins to reclaim the treaty rights that had been slowly stripped away. Their fight led to the huge 1974 Bolt decision, a massive legal victory that reaffirmed native fishing rights. It was a powerful echo of those early conflicts over who controls the land and its resources.
And then in 1999, the whole world's attention turned to the battle in Seattle. Tens of thousands of protesters hit the streets to challenge the World Trade Organization. This moment really shone a global spotlight on all the anxieties that came with the very economic system that was making Washington a modern-day success story.
So all of that brings us to today. Washington's been riding the second wave for more than 70 years now. And if that long wave theory holds true, well, that means the state might be getting close to another crossroads. Which begs the question, what's next?
And you know, this isn't some new question people just started asking. This is what's so wild. An economic report from way back in 1987 already pointed out that Washington had a relatively low rate of new business creation. The thinking is that when your current industries are so dominant and successful, there's actually less pressure for people to start the risky new ventures that could become the foundation of the next wave. It suggests that even decades ago, the second wave was already showing signs of maturing.
And that leaves us right here with the big question. Washington's history has shown us this clear pattern: rise, stagnate, and then reinvent. So if the second wave of jets and code is reaching its peak, what industries, what ideas, and what new challenges will shape Washington's third wave?
Today, we're diving into a city that's defined by its incredible, almost unbelievable power to rise from its own ashes again and again. And that city is Atlanta, Georgia, the Phoenix City. Now, this isn't just some catchy nickname. It's literally the story of the city. You see, Atlanta wasn't founded on a big river or a natural harbor. Nope, it was built for one purpose: to be the end of a railroad line. That made it a target, and this cycle of destruction and rebirth, it's the very core of its identity. So to really get Atlanta, you have to start with its first great trial by fire, the American Civil War. This is where that whole Phoenix story really takes flight. Atlanta was a city born from pure logistics. Back in the day, railroads were basically the internet, this revolutionary tech connecting the whole country. So in 1837, this spot was founded with the super simple name Terminus, because, well, it was the end of the line. But as more and more rails connected here, the town just exploded, becoming this critical industrial hub for the South right as the Civil War was kicking off. With all those rail lines and factories, Atlanta quickly became the logistical heart of the Confederacy. I mean, it wasn't just a city, it was an arsenal. You had armor for ships, cannons, ammunition. Pretty much everything was either being made here or moved through here. And that, of course, put a giant target right on its back. And in September 1864, the breaking point came. As Confederate General John Bell Hood retreated, he ordered his men to destroy 81 railcars packed with ammunition so they wouldn't fall into Union hands. Union General William T. Sherman actually documented the sound of those explosions himself. It was, without a doubt, the beginning of the end for Old Atlanta. And this was what was left. After the Confederates pulled out, Sherman's army systematically destroyed anything that had any military value. Reports from the time estimate that about 3/4 of the entire city was just gone, annihilated. These were the very first ashes from which Atlanta would have to rise. Okay, so rebuilding the city's structures. That was one thing. But as Atlanta moved into the 20th century, healing its deep social wounds was a totally different challenge. The next great fire wasn't one of flames, but of racial and social conflict. This incredibly powerful quote comes from a Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial by a guy named Ralph McGill. He wrote it the day after a horrific event completely shattered the city's carefully crafted image. He was basically saying, look, when leaders encourage people to defy the law, they can't act surprised when things get violent. So what prompted that editorial? This. On the one hand, Atlanta had this brand, the city too busy to hate, trying to seem like a progressive Southern hub. But the reality, on October 12, 1958, was 50 sticks of dynamite blowing a massive hole in a prominent Jewish temple. That bombing just ripped the cover off the violent racism and anti-Semitism that was simmering right beneath the city's polished surface. So why this temple? Well, because its rabbi, Jacob Rothschild, was a powerful and very outspoken advocate for civil rights. He was a friend of Dr. King and was actively fighting to integrate Atlanta. And get this, While 5 suspects with ties to white supremacist groups were arrested, no one was ever convicted for the bombing. It was just a stark reminder of the deep, painful divisions the city was grappling with. But out of all that social turmoil came another reinvention, this time a political one. The old power structure started to crack, and that made way for a new vision of what Atlanta could be, led by a whole new generation of leaders. The city was at a major turning point, and the year was 1973, a moment that would change not just Atlanta, but the entire American South. At just 35 years old, Maynard Jackson wins the election. This was a seismic shift. It's hard to overstate what a big deal this was. For the first time in history, an African-American leader was at the helm of a major southern city, ready to completely reshape its future. And wow, did he build a new future? Jackson took the airport and transformed it into the massive global hub it is today. He created programs to make sure that city contracts, for everything from construction to the shops in that new airport, were also awarded to businesses owned by minorities and women. He wanted to spread the city's economic growth more fairly. He also pushed forward the MARTA rail system, and, probably most famously, he led the charge to bring the 1996 Olympics to Atlanta, putting the city firmly on the world stage. And that brings us to Atlanta's most recent and maybe its most symbolic act of rebirth. This transformation is amazing because it goes right back to the beginning. It's all about repurposing the very thing that created the city in the first place, its railroads. Enter the Atlanta Beltline. The idea, which, believe it or not, came from a Georgia Tech student's 1999 master's thesis, was so simple but so ambitious. Take this 22-mile ring of old, useless railroad tracks that circle the city and divided it, and turn it into a unifying thread of parks and trails. So what were the ashes this time? It wasn't a city burned by war, but one scarred by industrial decay. These tracks, once the city's absolute lifeblood, had become this rusty, neglected belt of division that cut neighborhoods off from each other. And the rebirth has been absolutely stunning. It is one of the coolest urban renewal projects in the entire country. The Beltline is now Atlanta's public square, its backyard, a green artery that connects communities that were once totally separated. It just proves, once again, that Atlanta's greatest strength is its ability to see a brilliant future in the ruins of its own past. From a railroad terminus burned to the ground, to a divided city that found a new political voice, to an industrial relic reborn as a civic treasure, the story of Atlanta is this constant, incredible cycle of reinvention. So the only real question left to ask is, what's next?
Some cities have a story, but Pittsburgh has lived like 3 different lives. It's a story of being born, dying, and then being completely reborn. Today, we're going to trace that incredible journey, from a critical frontier outpost to the industrial giant that, literally built America, and then to something entirely new.
So where does it all begin? Well, it all comes down to geography. Location, 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 right? Way before it was ever a city, this one specific spot, right where the Ohio River starts, was seen as incredibly important. A young George Washington, way back in 1753, took one look and got it instantly. He said it had absolute command of both rivers. And wow, was he right. That one little point of land would be at the center of everything for the next 200 years.
And of course, when something is that valuable, what happens? People fight over it. This became a major point of contention. And let's be clear, this wasn't empty land waiting to be claimed. It was home to Native American tribes for centuries. But soon, it became the prize in a huge tug-of-war between 2 global superpowers, the French and the British, both desperate to control North America.
And this timeline, it just shows you how brutal that fight was. It was a constant back and forth. In 1754, boom, the French grab an unfinished British fort and build their own, Fort Duquesne. A year later, the British tried to take it back with a huge army and get absolutely crushed. It took them until 1758 to finally get control and build Fort Pitt. But even then, it wasn't over. Just a few years later, in 1763, the fort was under a massive siege during Pontiac's War. It was just non-stop conflict.
Okay, so once the dust from the frontier wars finally settled, Pittsburgh's second life began. And this one wasn't forged in battle, it was forged in fire, literally. The whole region was sitting on top of some of the richest coal seams in the world. It was just perfectly placed to become an industrial monster. First, it was the Iron City, and then it became the legendary Steel City.
And when we say boom, the scale is just, it's staggering.
Look at this number, 50%. By 1911, this one city, Pittsburgh, was making half of all the steel in the entire country. Let that sink in. Half. The sheer industrial power packed into this one place was just unbelievable.
And it wasn't just any steel. This number here tells an even bigger story. We're talking about the literal backbone of the country. Think about the skyscrapers, the bridges, the railroads that were being built all across America. Where did the steel for all that come from? Well, the girders, the big structural pieces, nearly 60% of them came from right here in Allegheny County. Incredible.
But you know, this kind of massive boom, it always has a dark side. There were two completely different stories happening at the same time. On one side, you had these industrial titans, guys like Andrew Carnegie and his famously ruthless partner Henry Clay Frick, making fortunes that are almost impossible to wrap your head around. But on the other side, you had the workers. They were fighting for their lives, for fair pay, for basic safety, and that fight led to some of the bloodiest labor conflicts in American history, like the Great Railroad Strike and the infamous Homestead Strike.
And yeah, there was another price to pay, a really heavy one. The city got a new nickname, the Smoky City. And it was no joke. The air was so thick, so choked with soot and smog from all the coal and steel production, that they sometimes had to turn the streetlights on in the middle of the afternoon. Just imagine that. It was a city that was literally suffocating from its own success. And then, just like that, it was over. Almost as fast as it grew, the whole thing came crashing down. This is the story of the Great Collapse. It wasn't just an industry that died. It was the city's entire identity. Everything it had been for 100 years, just gone.
This says it all, doesn't it? After decades of being on top of the world, it was like a perfect storm. You had fierce competition from overseas. The mills here were getting old and inefficient, and then a huge recession hit. The steel industry in Pittsburgh didn't just fade away, it imploded.
And this chart, this shows you just how bad it was. I mean, it's a catastrophe. In the wake of the recession in the early 80s, the region just hemorrhaged jobs. We're talking over 153,000 manufacturing jobs gone. The engine that had powered Pittsburgh for a century didn't just slow down, it seized up. It died.
And a shockwave like that doesn't just stop at the factory gates. The ripple effect was devastating. It wasn't only the mill workers who lost their jobs, huge corporate headquarters. We're talking giants like Gulf Oil and Westinghouse. They were bought out or left. This kicked off a massive brain drain as all the high-paying white-collar jobs disappeared. Railroads, mines, all the businesses that supported the steel industry, they closed down too. And people just left. The city's population went into a nosedive.
But this is where the story gets really incredible. Because it's not just about a collapse, it's about a rebirth. It's a real phoenix from the ashes story. Out of the wreckage of the steel industry, Pittsburgh had to start this unbelievably hard journey of completely reinventing itself. And it did that by pivoting to a whole new economy, one built around its universities and hospitals, what people started calling eds and meds. I mean, look at this. This comparison tells you everything you need to know. Back in the day, the biggest employer was U.S. Steel. Now, it's the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, UPMC. The whole economic landscape has flipped. Heavy manufacturing is basically gone, and in its place you have massive healthcare systems and these world-class universities like Pitt and Carnegie Mellon. And here's the amazing part. It worked. That brain drain from the 80s, it completely reversed. Now it's a brain gain. Pittsburgh has become a huge hub for technology. You've got all the biggest names setting up shop there. We're talking Google, Apple, Intel, Facebook, and on top of that, there's this whole ecosystem of new companies, especially in really cutting-edge stuff like self-driving cars and robotics. So where does that leave Pittsburgh today? What's the next chapter in this story? Well, it's all about finding a way to connect these two different worlds, to bridge that tough industrial past with this new, shiny, high-tech future.
You know, Pittsburgh is famous for its bridges. Fun fact, it has 446 of them. That's more than any other major city on the planet. But those bridges, they're not just steel and rivets. They're so much more than that.
Yeah, they've become the perfect symbol for the city's whole journey. These bridges, right? They were built with the steel from Pittsburgh's first life. And now they represent how this city managed to build a connection between its tough industrial past and its totally different high-tech future.
And really, that leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? Pittsburgh's story is incredible, but it makes you think. How does a city do that? How do you honor that gritty, blue-collar past while you're building a completely new future? It's a tough balancing act, and it's a question that so many cities all around the world are still trying to answer today.
The Boston Massacre. You've probably seen that famous picture, right? The one with the British soldiers firing on a helpless crowd. It looks pretty simple, a clear-cut case of tyranny. But the real story of what happened on that snowy night back in 1770, well, it's a whole lot messier, more complicated, and way more important to the American story than you might think. So, let's get into it. 'Cause that's really the heart of it, isn't it? This wasn't some grand, planned battle. It was a chaotic, nasty fight on a city street that ended with 5 people dead. So how on earth did that moment become the spark that lit the fuse for a revolution? That's the puzzle we're going to piece together. To really understand this, we have to go right back to the chaos of that night. It's Monday, March 5th, 1770, and the tension in Boston is so thick you could cut it with a knife. It's about to snap. What's just wild about this timeline is how fast it all spiraled out of control. It starts with some trash talk, a kid insulting an officer, and within an hour, thanks to those church bells ringing out, which was the signal for trouble, hundreds of angry Bostonians are flooding the streets. Captain Preston and his men are completely surrounded, getting pelted with ice, rocks, you name it. Then a soldier gets knocked flat, and in the sheer pandemonium that follows, shots are fired. When the smoke finally clears, 11 men have been shot. 5 of them will die. 5 civilians, including a man named Crispus Attucks, a former slave of mixed African and Native American heritage, are now dead, killed by soldiers of the British Crown. The spark has just hit a powder keg. So why was Boston so ready to just explode like that? The shooting on King Street didn't happen in a vacuum. The whole city was a tinderbox, just waiting for a match. And that match was the British military occupation. On this slide, you can really see the two worlds colliding. For the colonists, it was all about taxation without representation. They were furious about the Townshend Acts and just hated the constant presence of soldiers on their streets. But from the British perspective, it was simple. We're here to enforce the law and protect our officials from getting attacked. You had 2 completely opposing worldviews crammed into one very small, very tense city. And the pressure had been building for years. I mean, you had newspapers fanning the flames, sailors being forced into the Royal Navy, riots over seized ships. But the thing that really pushed the city over the edge, it was the death of an 11-year-old boy, Christopher Sider. He was shot and killed by a customs official just 11 days before the massacre. His funeral was one of the biggest Boston had ever seen, and it left the city grieving and absolutely seething with anger. But here's the thing. This friction wasn't just about recent taxes or soldiers on the street. To really get to the bottom of it, we have to zoom way out. The conflict was about something much, much deeper. A fundamental fight over power and land that went all the way back to the city's founding. Okay, so check this out. You have 3 completely different ideas about who controls the ground people are standing on. The local Massachusetts people, they believed land couldn't be owned by a person. It could only be used. The English crown, on the other hand, claimed total, absolute ownership over any land it decided was unoccupied. And the English settlers, they thought the King's Charter gave them the legal right to that land. These competing ideas were at the very core of the colonies, and the fight over taxes was, in a way, just the latest chapter in this much older power struggle. Now, let's get back to the immediate aftermath, because the moment the shooting stopped, a whole new battle began, the battle for the story. What actually happened was chaotic and confusing, but what it meant, well, that was going to be very carefully constructed. And Paul Revere's famous engraving is a straight-up masterclass in propaganda. This is not a photograph of what happened, it's an argument. It tells a powerful story designed to make you angry. He shows the soldiers lined up like a firing squad, the crowd as innocent victims. He even labels the building behind them Butcher's Hall. Revere created this simple, unforgettable image of British tyranny. But then you see this. This is how John Adams, a patriot, by the way, who actually defended the soldiers in court to make sure they got a fair trial, described the crowd. He didn't see peaceful victims. He saw a motley rabble, a diverse, aggressive, and chaotic mob. So which was it? A massacre of the innocent? Or soldiers defending themselves from a full-blown riot? The court's verdicts were complicated. They didn't really make either side happy. Captain Preston and 6 of his men were acquitted, found not guilty.
Only 2 soldiers were found guilty of anything, and it wasn't murder, it was the lesser crime of manslaughter. This was a far, far cry from the bloody massacre that the Patriot propaganda machine was selling. So how did those 2 soldiers avoid the death penalty? They used this wild legal loophole called benefit of clergy. It was this ancient thing left over from medieval times that basically let a first-time offender get a lighter sentence. So instead of being hanged, the 2 soldiers got their thumbs branded with a big M for manslaughter and were shipped back to England. So with the trials done and most of the soldiers off the hook, you might think the story just kind of fizzles out there. But you would be wrong, because the memory of the massacre, the story that the Patriots kept telling, was about to become way more powerful than the actual event itself. The Patriots were geniuses at controlling the narrative. Every year on Massacre Day, they held these big public events with fiery speeches to keep the memory of the bloody massacre fresh in everyone's minds. That constant reminder of British tyranny is what directly fueled things like the Boston Tea Party, and that, in turn, led to Britain's crackdown with the Intolerable Acts, and finally, to the first shots of the Revolutionary War. It's a direct line. In just 5 years, a street brawl had set a revolution in motion. And that brings us right back to our big question. The Boston Massacre was a chaotic, tragic, legally messy event, but it became a simple, powerful story of good versus evil, of tyranny versus liberty. And that story convinced a whole generation of colonists that their rights were something worth fighting for and even dying for. It just makes you wonder, doesn't it? At the end of the day, what's more powerful, the thing that actually happens, or the story we decide to tell about it?
So, picture this. It's 1793. And America's shiny new capital, Philadelphia, is basically on top of the world. And then, a plague hits. And it doesn't just hit. It brings the entire city to its knees. In this explainer, we're going to unpack how this one crisis put the entire young nation to the ultimate test.
And you gotta understand, this wasn't just some medical disaster. No, this was a massive test for the brand new American Republic. It pushed its scientific confidence, its social bonds, its whole sense of right and wrong, right to the breaking point.
So that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? How does a city that sees itself as the next London or Paris, the absolute peak of American achievement, just completely fall apart? How does its greatest moment turn into its worst nightmare, seemingly overnight?
To really get a sense of just how bad this was, you have to start with the numbers. We're talking over 5,000 people dead in just a few months. Now, that might not sound like a huge number today, but back then, that was 1 out of every 10 people in the entire city. Just gone.
And what's absolutely wild is the irony of it all. Just 1 year before, in 1792, Philly's top doctors were literally bragging that their city was the healthiest place on earth. Fast forward 1 year, and a resident is describing a level of distress never before seen in America. I mean, the whiplash is just incredible.
Okay, so before we dive into the chaos, you really have to appreciate what Philadelphia was at that moment. It wasn't just a city, it was the city. We're talking the political capital, the cultural hub, the center for science and medicine for the entire United States. It was the whole shebang.
And nothing captures that feeling better than this quote from Dr. Benjamin Rush. He was basically the rock star doctor of his day. He's wondering out loud, hey, maybe America will be the one to cure the world's worst diseases. You can just feel the optimism, right? That confidence, maybe even a little bit of hubris.
And this gets to a really core belief they had. They truly thought their city was healthy because its people were good. They believed that moral virtue, being industrious, simple, good Republicans, directly protected them from disease. It's a fascinating idea, and it was about to be completely and tragically shattered.
And then it happened. In the sticky, oppressive heat of 1793, the fever showed up. Nobody really knew what it was, but they knew one thing. It was absolutely terrifying.
And things just spiraled out of control so fast. In August, it's just a few confusing cases. By September, full-blown panic. Half the city is running for their lives. October is the peak. The city is just totally overwhelmed by the dead and dying. It wasn't until the first frost in December that things finally calmed down.
So as the fever reached its terrible peak, the city itself just broke. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, well, it became the city of brotherly fear. All those bonds that hold a society together, they just snapped.
You could practically taste the fear in the air. We're talking 20,000 people fled the city. That's almost half the population. And get this, that includes the top brass. President George Washington, gone. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, gone. They just abandoned the capital, leaving the country pretty much rudderless.
There was this publisher, Matthew Carey, who lived through it all, and his words just send a chill down your spine. He talked about a total dissolution of the bonds of society. Think about what that means. It wasn't just the government that fell apart. It was everything: family, friendship, the most basic human connections.
And when he said total, he meant it. Husbands literally left their wives to die alone. Parents abandoned their own sick children. If you were a servant who got sick, you were just carted off to a pest house to die. The government just stopped working. It was a complete and utter breakdown of civilization. So, while all this is happening on the streets, another kind of chaos is erupting. The city's doctors, the very people who were supposed to have the answers, the voices of reason, they were completely lost, and they started turning on each other.
Yeah, the medical community basically split down the middle. On one side, you had Dr. Rush, who was convinced the fever was homegrown, caused by some rotting filth in the city. On the other side was Dr. Curry, who swore it was imported. And look, this wasn't just some academic debate. The answer decided what you did. Do you clean up the city, or do you shut down the port?
But the real fireworks were over the treatment. Dr. Rush came up with this heroic cure. It involved extreme bloodletting and purging. We're talking about draining up to 4/5 of a person's blood. His opponents were horrified. They called it a murderous dose. So you have the city's top doctors basically accusing each other of being killers while people are dying in the streets. So, with the doctors fighting and society falling apart, a lot of people started looking for answers somewhere else. They stopped seeing this as a medical problem. They started seeing it as a moral one, a punishment. And Matthew Carey, that writer we heard from earlier, he really nailed this feeling. The thinking went that Philadelphia had just gotten too big for its britches, too proud, too luxurious, too sinful. The plague, in their eyes, was a humbling, a cosmic correction for a city that had lost its moral compass. And oh, they had a list of what those sins were. First, a new circus, which, in a really dark twist of fate, ended up becoming the first pest house. Then there was a new theater, seen as decadent. And just in general, they pointed to what they saw as widespread drunkenness, lewdness, fraud, pride, and avarice. Basically, they thought the city had gotten spiritually sick long before the fever ever arrived.
So when the cold weather finally came and the fever died down, the city was left with these deep, permanent scars. It would never really be the top dog again. But here's the strange part. Philadelphia's loss, in a way, turned out to be a gain for the rest of the young nation.
Yeah, it's this really interesting dual legacy. On one hand, Philadelphia took a massive hit. It lost its status as the political and commercial capital. Its amazing intellectual community was shattered. But for America as a whole, this created new opportunities. Other cities started to rise. The crisis actually kickstarted the creation of a national medical system and sparked research all over the country.
So, what's the bottom line here? The epidemic basically killed the idea that America would have one single central capital for everything. The tragedy forced the nation's intellectual life to spread out, to become more decentralized. And you know what? That actually made it stronger and more resilient in the long run.
And that leaves us with this really big, complicated question. Is it possible for a catastrophe, something that absolutely destroys a city's golden age, to also be the very thing that helps forge a stronger, more complex nation? It's a tough one, but it's the question that this incredible, tragic story leaves us to think about.
You know, if you've ever walked around Manhattan, you've felt it, right? That relentless, logical order of the streets and avenues. But here's the thing, that iconic grid, it wasn't an accident. It didn't just evolve over time. Nope. It was the result of one single, incredibly audacious plan from over 200 years ago. A blueprint that literally tamed an island and created a metropolis. And this contrast, well, it's everything. On one side, you've got nature's logic, cowpaths, trails winding around hills and swamps. And on the other, you have human logic, this rigid, almost brutal order just stamped on top of it. The story of how one became the other is honestly one of the most radical city transformations in history. So, how in the world did this happen? Well, we're going to trace the whole story. We'll start with a city that was just bursting at the seams. Look at some early kind of failed attempts at order, and then get to the powerful commission that finally got the authority to just impose a solution. We'll follow the surveyors who had to chart the wild island, see the grid's radical vision come to life, and finally unpack the legacy that, let's be honest, we're all still living in today. Okay, so let's set the stage with the core problem. New York City was basically a powder keg of growth, and it had absolutely no plan to contain the explosion. I mean, you have to picture this. Beyond the tiny, settled tip of the island, Manhattan was just wilderness. It was this rugged landscape of hills, swamps, streams, all tangled up in these old, confusing trails. This was not the foundation for a city that was dreaming of becoming a world capital. No way. And here's the pressure cooker. The population was exploding. I mean, it more than doubled in just 20 years. People were pouring into the city, which meant it had to spill northward into all that chaos. Without a plan, you just get this unmanageable, unhealthy sprawl. The city desperately needed order, and it needed it yesterday. Now, the idea of a grid didn't just pop out of thin air in 1811. The concept was already kind of taking root in smaller, private developments around the island. You had these powerful families like the Delanceys and the Bayards, and they were already laying out these neat, orderly grids on their own land just to seal it off. You can still see their fingerprints in neighborhoods like Soho today. There was even this big, ambitious citywide proposal, the Mangan-Gurk Plan, but it got shot down by politics. So, there were promising starts, but they were just piecemeal fixes for a massive, citywide crisis. The city council was completely paralyzed. Every single time they tried to impose some kind of plan, landowners and different political groups would just shut it down. So they did something pretty radical. They went to the New York state government and basically said, "Help, we need you to step in and create a commission with absolute power." And so, in 1807, the state appointed 3 men to decide Manhattan's fate. And get this lineup: Gouverneur Morris, a famous founding father, John Rutherford, a former U.S. senator, and Simeon DeWitt, the state's top surveyor. This was no committee of local bureaucrats. These guys were nation builders, and they thought on that kind of grand scale. The state gave them exclusive power, and honestly, this is the key to the whole story. This meant they could just draw lines on a map, and those lines would become reality, plowing right through private property, existing buildings, whatever. It was an almost unheard of amount of authority just handed over to 3 guys. So, with that power secured, the really monumental physical work began. Before they could even think about planning the island, they had to map every single inch of it, every hill, swamp, stream, and rock. And the guy they picked for this massive, back-breaking task was John Randall Jr. And, you're not going to believe this, he was only 20 years old when he was given this huge responsibility of turning the island's wilderness into precise scientific data. Just 20. And his job was anything but easy. I mean, it was a nightmare. Randall and his team were constantly fighting the terrain, hacking through dense bushes, slogging through marshes, but they were also fighting the people. Landowners accused them of trespassing. They sued them. They even had Randall arrested. It was a grueling, thankless, and pretty often a dangerous job. After almost 4 years of that brutal survey work, the job was finally done. In 1811, the commissioners unveiled their final plan, a vision that would stamp a whole new kind of order on Manhattan forever. So why a simple grid, right? Why not the beautiful circles or grand avenues you see in European capitals? Well, their reasoning, in their own words, really shows you their mindset. It was pure pragmatism. For them, beauty and tradition took a back seat to what was cheap, efficient, and convenient. This wasn't about creating a beautiful city. It was about creating a functional, profitable one. A vision of Republican simplicity and economic good sense. And this was their philosophy in action. The grid was a total imposition of human will onto the landscape. It just sliced across hills, filled in ponds, paved over streams. It completely ignored property lines, farms, estates, everything. It was this top-down vision of absolute, uncompromising order. But hold on. As you look at the super rigid plan, you might notice that a very famous, very large piece of Manhattan is completely gone. What's missing from this picture? That's right, Central Park. It was not part of the original plan. It actually took another 40 years for New Yorkers to realize that this relentless grid needed a massive green lung. The land for the park wasn't even set aside until the 1850s as a major correction to the original vision. The 1811 plan did have a few small public squares, but nothing on the scale of what was to come. And you can bet people at the time had opinions. The reaction was sharply divided. Supporters were hailing it as visionary and orderly, a perfect expression of Republican values. But critics, they condemned it as monotonous, rigid, and a tyrannical attack on the island's beautiful natural landscape. And you know what? That debate is still going on today. So what's the lasting legacy of all this? The truth is, we are all still living inside this 200-year-old blueprint. Its impact defines the New York City we know and experience today. The plan's legacy is, well, it's absolute. It's so much more than a historical document. It's the physical and maybe even the psychological framework of Manhattan. That relentless grid doesn't just dictate how you travel, it dictates how you perceive the city as a place of order, logic, and these infinite repeatable blocks. It is all a direct consequence of the lines those men drew on that map back in 1811. And look, you don't have to take my word for it. Its impact cannot be overstated. Historians have called it, and this is a quote, the single most important document in New York City's development. It dictated where millions would live and work and travel, for better and for worse, and it enabled the city to become the economic powerhouse it is today. Which leaves us with a huge question. Was the 1811 plan a stroke of visionary genius that created order from chaos? Or was it a kind of monotonous tyranny that just erased nature for the sake of convenience? As we think about building the cities of the future, the trade-offs that were made in Manhattan 2 centuries ago are more relevant than ever. What do we value most, the organic or the orderly?